Ahlquist, and thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for taking time out of your day to come and hear me talk about some research. I'm really excited about this talk. It's research in progress, and what's more, it's research that started and been conducted while I've been a postdoc at IRLE at UCLA. So it's still in progress, it's very incomplete, but we already have some interesting ideas, I think, and some interesting findings, and so I'm going to present what we have so far, and I'd love to hear any comments or questions you guys have and suggestions on how we might take this further, or if you happen to know people at the PMA who are sitting on strike data and you want to push them for us, I'll definitely take your help on that as well. But in any event, the talk I'm going to give is called You Can't Just Mess, you can't, start over again. You can just imagine what we'll do if you mess with our families, political strikes, and contract negotiations. This is part of a much larger project that I'll describe in just a second, but this is joint work with Margaret Levy, who's my dissertation advisor at the University of Washington, and who's now joined with the University of Washington and the newly developed United States Studies Center at the University of Sydney. So let me quickly just say a couple thank yous. So Igor is an undergraduate at the University of Washington who's been a very helpful research assistant, so I want to acknowledge him. Peter Turnbull from the University of Warwick has been very generous with his advice and sharing some of his data on ILWU and worldwide port strike behavior. Funding for this has largely been a result of funding from the National Science Foundation, but with help from the University of Washington's Harry Bridges Center, as well as my tenure here at the IRLE. So I want to thank the Institute and Chris and Kent and the office staff as well for a productive and exciting year. But let's kind of lay out what I want to try to do today. I think this talk is going to be an interesting kind of contribution to the set of colloquium talks we've had over the year, at least the ones that I've been able to attend, in that we've heard from repeated people coming from very different parts of the labor community and the academic community how important it is that unions, particularly in the United States, become something different, something bigger, something broader, something more politically active that can engage a broader section of the American electorate than the 8 to 12% of the population or of the labor force that unions currently represent in wage bargaining. And so that's the larger project that this is a part of. In particular, the kind of motivating question that this large project with Margaret is all about is what we call the Lenin problem. So Lenin, way back, puzzled about why is it that workers, you can get them to do things from time to time in their own interests for wages or to address a grievance in their own job site, but it's very difficult to get them to act in concert on a large scale to address things that may not be directly relevant to their own personal interests right at that moment. And how do you get large groups of workers to do that? That was his puzzle, and he had his own answer. We're not so interested in his answer, but his question, I think, still resonates and is even more relevant now, perhaps, than it was then. And that's the big motivating problem we're dealing with. And in particular, what is it about union organizations, the leadership, the role of the leaders, the rules that they operate under, the legal structure, their positions in the economy that enable some unions to be more politically active, to take action on larger sets of issues, and others do not. So that's the big project we're engaged in, and this is one part of that. And if we look at the stuff we've seen this year, so we had Gassapini, his co-author earlier on, really going through the AFL-CIO and the change to Wind Federation and explaining why everything they're talking about is really not meaningful because you can reorient the political activities of workers' organizations. We've seen examples of the SEIU locally getting their own members to take action about their own kids' education and how that might broaden the political activities and the political appeal of an organization like the SEIU. We've seen kind of non-union organizations or parallel union organizations in New York taking action on behalf of restaurant workers and trying to maintain a broader set of community relationships. And all these are kind of ways of doing this, but we're going to get at the really kind of early fundamental question. When can you get unions, or how is it that unions take strike or work stoppage action for things that aren't in their own self-interest? Or at least not their obvious immediate self-interest. And how might we be able to explain that? So that's the kind of broader context. So what I'm going to try to do, my initial plan was to have this really cool puzzle, present you the puzzle, give you a kind of formalized answer that we've developed, say, okay, this formalized answer has some implications that we can look for evidence for or against in some data, go to the data, say, look, we can tell you that our answer is right or our answer is wrong, and here's where we can go. Well, that's the ideal setting. That would be a complete published paper. That's not what I'm going to be able to do today. I'm going to be able to give you the puzzle. I'm going to be able to give you an attempt at an answer, and what its implications are, and then I'll give you some preliminary insights into here's some early data that we've been able to gather in code, some brief, kind of here's what some suggested findings we've got, and here's where it's taking us, here's where we're trying to go, and I'm really be excited to hear your comments or suggestions where what we're doing is unclear or maybe just uninteresting. So let's motivate the problem. As Chris mentioned, this larger project is dealing with a lot of historical case study work, and one of the unions we're looking at in great detail is the International Longshore and Warehouse Union. So if you're on the West Coast, I'm sure you've heard of them. This is the union that represents workers on the docks from British Columbia all the way down to San Diego. So just for a piece of trivia, there are different longshore unions on the east and west coast of the United States. So this is purely a West Coast union. The International Longshoremen's Association is a separate entity operating on the East Coast. The ILWU has long distinguished history of political militants. Harry Bridges obviously is the famous union leader coming out of the ILWU from the 30s all the way through the 70s. And last year on May Day, so almost exactly a year ago, the ILWU shut down all West Coast ports from San Diego to Bellingham to protest the Iraq War for an entire shift. So nobody turned out to work. And several of the union locals, particularly in Oakland and San Francisco and Seattle and Tacoma, all had big protest marches through downtown, all this kind of thing. All right, that's the kind of job action I'm describing. This is not obviously in the purview of the Longshore Union. It's not often that a union has its own foreign policy. The ILWU does, typically. And they've long been opposed to the Iraq War, but they chose to shut down the ports last year on May Day. It also happened that the ILWU contract was expiring last summer. So they entered into formal contract negotiations with the employer association, the Pacific Maritime Association, in June. It also just so happens that this guy, Big Bob McElrath, who's the president of the ILWU right now, this was his first, he had just been recently elected president a couple years before. This was the first longshore contract negotiation that he had entered into as president. And what's more, if you guys think back to the last ILWU PMA contract in 2002, it was extremely contentious. It ended up being a lockout of the union workers. If you lived in the Bay Area or in Seattle, you saw container ships. You drove over the Bay Bridge, there was 30, 40 container ships anchored in the bay. If you lived down here, there was container ships all up and down the coast sitting there waiting for workers to come and unload their ships. There was a Taft-Hartley injunction. There was all manner of accusations of the president getting involved on behalf of the employers and so on and so forth. So ultimately, the unions actually, the ILWU won most of what it wanted in that contract negotiation, but at a fairly extreme cost in terms of time lost, working time lost, union finances, union political resources, and things of that sort. So it's not a pleasant thing. And what's more, they signed a contract that's much longer than what they typically like to sign. So usually they try to sign a 3-year contract. This one was obviously doubled at a 6-year contract. So they didn't win everything. So this is the kind of puzzle we're looking at, and it's also giving you a little bit of hints as to kind of the direction for explanation that we're going to look to. So for those of you into participant observation, this is a photo we took from the march in Seattle. I just thought I'd throw it up there because it's my hard drive. So there was a march. I was there. I took the photo. I'm not in the photo. So those are a bunch of University of Washington labor studies people there. I didn't want to put any photos of actual longshoremen there for fear of offending them for some reason. I didn't get permission to circulate their images. So that's just us. In any event, what were the reactions to this work stoppage for May Day last year? What were people saying? Well, here's what the LA Times says. The LA Times editorial page said it was a demonstration of union power directed at the Pacific Maritime Association. Longshoremen would be wise not to try to push the shippers too hard, given the stresses the industry faces in the current economy. And by the way, this is well before the current disaster befell us. So if you look at shipping data through all West Coast ports is off almost 25%, and this drop-off started in October. And this was well after this occurred. So things were already looking kind of dicey back in May, but that kind of worry about the economy and the state of affairs and the amount of work that longshoremen might have going forward was definitely been borne out. So the PMA comes back, and the PMA says the strike raised the question of whether this was an attempt to leverage contract negotiations. For their part, the ILWU, and this is taken from the Dispatcher, the ILWU's kind of official newspaper, says the May Day action had one important goal to protest the war in Iraq, but it also had produced some unexpected benefits, including a powerful display of membership solidarity, extraordinary public support, and extensive positive media coverage. Okay. So clearly not everybody believes that this particular strike was just because the union cared about the Iraq War. They think that there's something else going on. So here's the puzzle, the broader puzzle we're posing, and this is the kind of one instantiation of this puzzle. Why would a union stop work over a political issue when the union's actions are unlikely to actually change the policy that they're protesting, and it's not in any obvious benefit to the union members in terms of wages, hours, working conditions, these types of things, to go out and give up a shift of work. And what's more, this particular job action is actually illegal under the union contract and under tax-hardening legislation. So the employer could have pushed something in the NLRB process and actually tried to extract some sort of fine or concession or payment from the union for having this work stoppage. So it's a costly activity for the union members and for the union as an organization. So why would they do this? So we're going to try to take seriously what we're calling the LA Times conjecture. And that is, there's something about this work stoppage that might be of use or benefit to the union in its impending contract negotiations with the employers. So before I go into kind of how we're going to look at that, it's worth noting a couple things. First off, why is this even important? Why might we care? Well, I already said there's all these arguments and statements in the literature, and Margaret has been one of the people out there promoting this in her own work, saying that unions, if they're going to be effective, and if they're going to do anything positive going forward, and if they're going to continue to have relevance to people, they need to attract new members, and what's more, they need to be relevant to people not in unions. So in order to do that, they have to have, they need to do things that are broader interest and in the interest of people that aren't members of particular unions. So how might that occur? So it's directly related to that broader issue. But on a more kind of academic, straightforward basis, there's been some really great research done over the last 15 years or so by Judith Stepan-Norris and Marty Zeitman, both of whom I believe were at the IRLE or whatever it was called at the time to do some of this work back in the 80s and 90s. And they go back and they look at the role of communist leadership in American unions in the 30s and 40s. And so how are they different, what happened? What they find is communist and communist-led unions are actually more democratic on average than the standard AFL, craft unions, or other types of CIO unions. And they tended to win better contracts on average than these other unions. Granted, there's some limitations in this data, but they make, given the confines of the data they have, they make a very convincing case that this in fact occurred, but they don't really have a good explanation for why that is. So why is it that having radical communist leadership would have any direct effect on the internal governance of the union, or would enable a union to win better contracts? They're silent on this. So to the extent we have something to say that here, we might have a possible explanation for their finding, that more radical, politically active, politically motivated unions, there might be a spillover benefit to what they can win in actual bargaining with employers. The other thing I want to note is that we're positing something of a rationalist explanation for these types of actions. And that is not to say that we don't believe that the unions, the union leaders, the union members don't have strong political commitments. We are convinced that they do. That is to say, just because you have an instrumental benefit for going on a political strike does not mean you're not opposed to the Iraq War on principle as well. But the Iraq War had been happening since 2003. The union chose to shut down the ports in 2008. They've done other things in the meantime, but there's an obvious question of, you may have a political commitment, but why do you pick the battles you do? Why do you choose to close down the ports at one point in time and not another? So that's, even if you still have a strong political commitment, you still have to pick your battles. And so that's kind of how this research would relate to that. So how might this work? Well, I'm not going to go through, in the paper version of this, there's a whole mathematical expression for all this stuff. I'm going to try to describe it kind of on a more intuitive basis, but a little intellectual history is worth discussing here. In the political science international relations literature about war and peace and when countries fight and when they don't, they actually looked back into the economics literature about bargaining between unions and employers and tried to take some of the stuff that the economists had developed and learned and already modeled and bring that and apply that to the relationships between countries and when they fight wars. And in the process of doing that, that literature has really drawn up and drawn upon and developed two really big ideas that we're going to kind of take inspiration from. And those are the notion of sunk costs or signaling when there's uncertainty, and the other notion is audience costs. And I'll tell you what those are in a second. But the first thing to note that if you think of a bargaining relationship, you have two parties that are bargaining over something, and there's some outcome that they both benefit from. If they both know each other's kind of willingness to fight or willingness to walk away from the table, and they both want to actually come to an agreement, if they both know all this information, there's never going to be any bargaining breakdown. There'll never be any strikes, because everyone knows everything. So in order to have some sort of strike or breakdown in negotiations, you have to have some amount of uncertainty on the employer side or on the union side. If any of you have ever been around bargaining negotiations, that's not surprising, right? Clearly, the employer and the union are not always certain about the willingness of an employer to take a strike, the ability of the union to sustain a strike, what the union really wants versus what they say they want, same thing for the employer. So there's all manner of uncertainty in bargaining negotiations. We're going to focus on one particular thing. And what I think is interesting about where this paper ends up going, or what I hope it ends up going, is that we'll end up taking some models that were developed in economics dealing with wage bargaining, applied in political science to war, and then learn what we learned in political science about war, take some of those ideas and apply them back to wage bargaining. So it's kind of this weird full circle thing. So maybe we can bring some ideas to the economists that they may not have considered based on what we know in political science. In any event, how does this formulation work? Well, there's a few assumptions. The first assumption is that the union can, there's a union and an employer. The union can either be strong, internally solidary, everyone's together on the same page. If there's a strike, everyone goes out, these types of things. Or it could be weak, it could be divided, there could be factions. One faction might be trying to undermine the leadership or trying to do something else. Another might not. And in any event, we'll just simplify and say the union can be strong or weak. The union knows whether it's strong or weak, but the employer doesn't know. What's more, whether the union is strong or whether it's weak affects how well the union will do in a strike. So if bargaining breaks down and there's an industrial strike, a strong union will get a better wage outcome than a weak union. So I think that's fairly uncontroversial. I think everyone can follow that. What's more, we're going to assume that strikes are costly. So unions, all else equal, would prefer not to strike, and employers, all else equal, would prefer not to have a strike. Also, I think fairly uncontroversial. The thing that is a little strange is in order to make this work, we basically assume that there's always something worth protesting. So if the union wants to go out on a political strike or to protest something that's separate from its bargaining issues, there's always something in the world they can choose to protest. And I think particularly if you care about, if you have left-leaning political commitments, if you care about certain sets of issues, you're always going to be dissatisfied with the way the world turns out. And I think the same thing goes for people on the right. Things are always going to be too far to the left for what you want. So if you have political commitments, there is, in fact, I think, always something worth protesting. But large wars, I think, are typical ways of coordinating people around a particular issue. So what we're going to set up is a situation in which the union has the opportunity to take one of these costly strikes, these political strikes, on issues that are unrelated to its bargaining situation before it actually enters into bargaining with the employer. So the union can or cannot do this, and this thing is costly. This political strike, the union had to give up a shift's worth of wages. It had the potential of being brought before the National Labor Relations Board. Things may not have gone as they hoped. So they take the strike, it's potentially costly, then they enter into bargaining. And this is the bargaining protocol we're going to deal with here. I'm not going to go through the details of that too much. Just suffice to say that in any bargaining model, the order of the way things work has strong implications for how things turn out. If you have questions about that, I can definitely go into that in more detail. Well, let's talk about what the model says. And this is a game theoretic construct, and there's two ways in which you can get an outcome here. One is a situation in which nobody does political strikes ever. So the strong unions and the weak unions both stay home for political issues, and then they go into wage bargaining with employers as they normally do. And if you have that kind of a situation, there will always be the positive probability of an industrial strike. Because, once again, there's been no ability for the union to communicate any information to the employer about how strong it is. But the other way you can have things is you'll get the strong union taking political strikes, and the weak union won't. Because it's too costly for the weak union to go out on a political strike. So in other words, this political activity, this shutting down the ports for May Day, for example, is a way for a strong union to credibly show an employer that they are in fact strong. That if you do mess with us, we are strong enough to defend ourselves, and you're going to pay a cost as well. So I know this is where the title of the paper comes from, right? Like, look, we're doing this, we're going off work, we're doing all this stuff for things that aren't even related to our day-to-day lives. Imagine what we will be willing to do if you actually come after our wages, our health care, our benefits, our job rules, what have you. So that's the basic kind of prediction from the model. This type of an equilibrium is possible. And it's possible so long as strikes are sufficiently costly. That is to say, industrial strikes, contract breakdowns are costly to both parties. And players are impatient. That is to say, the longer negotiations go on, the worse it is for both parties. What's more, if you observe a political strike here, then you're going to actually get no contract breakdowns in industrial strikes, because the union has been able to fully transmit all information to the employer. The employer knows whether if it sees a political strike or not, it knows that the union is strong or weak for sure, and there's no need for bargaining to break down into an industrial strike. So the belief stuff, these are some technical restrictions that we're still playing with in the model, and I'm going to skip those for the time being. So, what is this whole exercise bias, right? Like, so why do we know? What does this help us do? And I think what it helps us do is it helps us take these LA Times conjecture a little bit more seriously. So the LA Times said, yeah, the union's doing this because it wants to say something to the employer. Well, say what? So why would they want to say that? Why would that make any difference to anybody? And we think this is one way in which that might actually be occurring. But this could be wrong, easily. Like maybe the union just, that was the time that they decided they wanted to do it. Maybe there was a faction in the union who was opposed or who supported the Iraq War, and for whatever reason they left the union, and now they were able to get the vote to go on strike. Maybe there's something else going on, and this model doesn't tell us anything. So in order to go and see if this model has any sort of generalizable value, there's essentially two predictions we can go and look for in some data. So this first one here, political strike should only occur when the union is strong, is nice, but it's not meaningful if we're going to go as observers and go and try to test it. Because there's no way we're going to ever get data that will display whether or not the union is strong. If we could, the employer could obviously get the same data. There wouldn't be any problem of information, and the whole problem goes away. So this is kind of trivial and not really useful from an empirical perspective. But these latter two, I think, are. And the first one is, if there's some sort of discounting involved, you should see a greater propensity for political strikes to occur closer to the onset of contract negotiations. Right? So if they're going to do them way before, the employer might forget that, oh yeah, that's right, they shut down the ports 6 months ago. Oops. Or the employer might think, well, they were strong enough to shut down the ports 6 months ago, but maybe now they're more divided. I'm still not sure. So if they are trying to send an effective signal and there is some sort of discounting over time, the union will tend to do these types of actions closer to contract negotiations. The second one is coming from the implications of the model, and that is that the likelihood of an industrial work stoppage, that is, the negotiations breaking down into an industrial strike, is lower if there has been a political strike prior. So the employer is less willing to take an industrial strike if the union has been able to successfully demonstrate that it's already strong. So that's the basic logic. And these are two things we can actually go and look for in data. And in the, if you just look at this this May Day strike from last year, this, if you're to do kind of a path tracing or kind of interview thing of the actors involved, you would tend to, I think, see a series of events that would lead you to believe that this might have been what was occurring in that particular strike. But it's not clear that that's necessarily something that's more common. So that's what we're going to go try and look for. So, continuing to focus on the ILWU, we're going to look at work stoppages from the ILWU. We're trying to assemble a data set for all the work stoppages from the union's official founding in 1938 all the way to the present. And that's proven substantially more difficult than we initially thought, as I think happens all the time, I guess. But in any event, why are we focusing on this bargaining pair? Why don't we use broader data sets? Why don't we look at every union and these types of things? Well, in order to really test these implications that I just described to you, we have to know a lot of detail. In particular, we have to know when the contract is expiring for every bargaining pair. And we have to know that for a long period of time. And getting that data on a union-by-union basis is prohibitively expensive, let's just say. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics reports work stoppages, but it often doesn't disaggregate it by union, much less by bargaining union. So most unions have locals that bargain, at least in the United States, have locals that bargain independently of one another and may sign different contracts that expire at different times in different places. So even if we got a union by union or industry by industry work stoppage data set, that wouldn't give us enough information to actually examine this timing and contract negotiation problem. What's more, we need to know kind of what was the purported reason for a work stoppage. If we just know that work was stopped, we don't know if it was because of a safety reason, we don't know if it was because negotiations broke down, or because they didn't like the Iraq War, we just know the work was stopped. So we also have to be able to go into the work stoppage and see, okay, can we code this, if you will, as a political work stoppage or as something else? And so we need a lot of detail about the actual work stoppage itself in order to be able to do this. So that's why we're focusing on a particular bargaining pair. Ideally, in the future, we would like to broaden this out to other unions as well, but we're going to start with what we have the best access to. So the ILW-PMA pair is a nice one for a few reasons. First off, as I mentioned, the ILW has this long history of militants. So they've had these events from period on and off over the years, and it's been over a whole host of issues. It's been over Vietnam, it's been over apartheid, it's been over the Pinochet regime in Chile, it's been over the United States shipping scrap iron to Japan prior to World War II. Those are just a few. Then there's been all these solidarity actions as well in support of workers that are locked out or striking in all different industries all over the place. So the ILW has a long history of this type of militants. And the other thing is more directly relevant to the kind of technical needs of the data, and this is that they have coast-wise contracts all up and down the West Coast. So whenever the union negotiates, it's negotiating for all locals together at the same time. So I don't have to deal with the problem of the contract in Seattle expiring at a different time than the contract in St. Peter. So that's an additional benefit of looking at this particular contract pair or negotiating pair. We're still in the process of really gathering and coding this data, as I kind of alluded to at the beginning. You'd think this would be something that they would track in great detail, and on one level it is, but they may also be a little bit reluctant to share it. The other thing is what constitutes a work stoppage and how does that scale, really? Like, there is data down to like 3 guys refuse to work a particular ship in Oakland for 2.5 hours, and this gets referred to some arbitrator, and that shows up in the data. And is that the same thing as the whole West Coast shutting down? Clearly it's not. So trying to get enough granularity in the data to really tease these things out and appropriately aggregate or disaggregate particular work stoppages is really where this is becoming a problem. So right now we have data from a variety of different sources for a variety of time slices. At the moment, our most reliable data come from the PMA, and they cover the 1966 to 76 period. And this is actually coming from a series of reports and testimony they gave to Congress at the time. So it's very, very detailed work stoppage data across all West Coast ports for this whole time period. And what's more, they give information about the purported cause. So workers stopped work on ship X in San Pedro because there was a loose winch and it was a safety issue, and maybe that's why they stopped. Or workers stopped work because there was a picket line set up by some other union and they would stop work to respect that picket line. Or they stopped work and they'll say a political vote on the union, things of that sort. So that will appear in this data, and that's mostly what I'm going to discuss now. But even this is still kind of a little dicey to work with. So once again, all the results I'm going to show you are definitely suggestive and kind of preliminary, and I think show kind of where this is going to go. But I would definitely not circulating the paper yet because I don't want to claim that we found anything that we may not turn out to have found. But in any event, work stoppages, we're going to code them as one of 3 things: industrial, solidary, or political. So industrial is kind of our default category. We're going to assume that a work stoppage is related to wages, hours, working conditions, or safety if no other reason is given. I think that's a fairly conservative assumption and not too problematic. The other 2, the solidary action is where the union is striking or stopping work to respect the work stoppage of another union. So to respect another union's picket line, support striking workers elsewhere. The ILW does this all the time. I talked to some of the people in the San Pedro local, and they actually have a set of rules as to, like, it's almost automatic. Like, they don't have to take a vote or anything. It's like, if these 3 conditions obtain, you have every right as your individual worker to stop work immediately on a particular shift. And that's San Pedro. I'm assuming it's similar in the other ILWU locals. Now, the reason why we're treating that as separate from the political strikes is because a solidary work stoppage, there's clearly an implicit understanding of reciprocity there. It will support you, particularly if you're dealing with other longshore unions. So the ILW is really militant about not loading cargo that's been loaded by scab labor in other ports where there's strikes. So in Australia, they supported the strikers down there in 1998, the Liverpool dock workers and the big strike in the UK a while back, about 15 years ago now, I guess. They were very militant in supporting those workers, but even other workers that aren't necessarily longshoremen, they will not cross picket lines. And clearly the expectation is that if or when the ILWU ends up in a bitter strike with their employer, and the employer tries to break the ILWU, those unions will support the ILWU. So we think that's somewhat analytically distinct from the notion of a political strike that doesn't have any obvious connection to their interests in the short or even the medium to longer term. So that's how we're coding our strikes. And we're going to focus right now mainly on the political strikes. So these are some fairly simple statistical models, but I'm just going to tell you what else we're going to control for, if you will. So the first thing is the key variable for the timing of the contract calendar is just the quarters until the contract expires. So as this number gets smaller, you're closer and closer and closer to contract expiration, or you're closer to negotiations starting. So if we're going to look at that first hypothesis, for example, the idea that you should see more political strikes closer to contract expiration, you should see a negative coefficient on that variable. So the smaller that number is, the more likely it is you're going to see a political strike. We know that strikes are strongly related to the business cycle. So when times are bad, workers tend to strike less. So the way we're measuring that is an industry level change in GDP essentially. So the amount of GDP generated by the transport and shipping sector, and is that growing or declining from quarter to quarter? An unemployment rate overall, and then some political variables about the ILWU. So the ILWU has big conventions that votes, and officers are elected, and policy is set every couple of years. So is it a convention year or not? I don't have an immediate expectation as to why that would matter, but you can imagine union leaders might be more reticent to take a risky action if they're about to come up for re-election, for example. And then an indicator for who the ILWU president was. Was it Harry Bridges? Was it Big Bob McGowrath? Was it Dave Arian? Was it somebody else? Whether or not it was the first contract for that particular president to negotiate as president. And then some political things. Are they striking more frequently when there's a large number of GOP governors in the western states? Are they striking more frequently when you have a Republican in the White House? So these are our major kind of controls, if you will. I'm going to describe, wrong direction. So we started off, the earliest way we did this is like, all right, let's just be very simple. Let's just say in a particular quarter, was there or was there not a political strike? And was there or was there not an industrial strike of any size or any magnitude? Purely presence or absence. This is very stark, fairly reductionist, and on incomplete data. And so I'm just going to kind of briefly summarize the kind of mixed results we got from these models and then go into a little bit more complicated one in a second. But from these models, we found that impending contract negotiations were not systematically related to the presence or absence of a political strike in any particular quarter. But the second hypothesis, that if there was a political strike in a particular quarter, or the lagged quarter, it was much less likely you would have an industrial strike in the current quarter. So a little bit of mixed evidence, once again, the reliability of the data on this, and this is breaking out the data by different time periods as well. Some mixed evidence, as you might expect from some preliminary data. So then we said, okay, well, we're going to go try to get a little bit deeper. Now we're doing counts of strikes in a quarter. So how many industrial strikes, how many political strikes in a quarter? So this first one, the outcome we're trying to say is what can we use to predict the number of political strikes in a particular quarter? The thing, I can use my little laser beam. So this is just, did the contract expire in that quarter? And is the time to expiration, how many quarters till the contract expires? So we see some, kind of preliminary evidence in favor of the argument. So this is a negative, although small number. So as we get closer and closer and closer to the expiration of a contract, you have an increasing probability or increasing number of political strikes. And in quarters where the contract is expired or does expire, you see a larger number of political strikes as well. So the other stuff we don't see so we have unemployment is in the wrong direction here. There's really no effect for the GDP or the business cycle variable. The GOP governor variable is, I guess, the more GOP governors, the more likely is a political strike, is what that says. This one, since this is limited data over only 10 years, this is really just breaking the data apart. So is this Johnson or is this Nixon, essentially, is what that's telling me. I wouldn't interpret this really as a meaningful reflection on the presidency.
Tell me again about the unemployment thing. What does it say?
So the unemployment variable says, it says essentially that there's no systematic relationship that we can discern between the overall national unemployment rate and the number of political strikes in a particular quarter.
Okay.
For this period, 1966 to 76. So now going to the second one here, these are the number of industrial work stoppages in a particular quarter, is what we're trying to model. That's the outcome that we're trying to model here. And this gives us, so these are the variables down here that relate to the political, the bargaining calendar and the political work stoppages. So this first one is, I guess fell off the bottom of the page. Well, anyways, how many political strikes were there in the current quarter. This one is how many political strikes were there in the last quarter, and this is how many political strikes were there 2 quarters ago. And this is time to contract expiration, so how many quarters till the contract expires, and this is, did it expire in the current quarter. So what we see is, particularly in the the 2 lag variables, we see a negative effect of the political strikes. That is to say, if there was the greater the number of political strikes in the last quarter and the quarter before that, the lower the number of industrial strikes you'll see in the current quarter. Okay? And so if you want to get, this looks like a tiny number, to give you an idea of what this means in terms of magnitude. So let's say we're in a quarter in which the contract expires in the next quarter, but we had a political strike last quarter and the quarter before. This is telling us that we would expect to see approximately 2 fewer industrial work stoppages this quarter than we would otherwise. That's an idea of the magnitude of what this translates into. So that's kind of a scenario you might expect to see, right? We're close to a contract expiration. We see some political work stoppages in the current or previous quarter, and that means in the current quarter we'll see approximately 2 fewer things that might get reported to the PMA as an industrial work stoppage. Working to rules, slowing down, walking off the job, these types of things. Interestingly enough, we see in a convention year, there's more work stoppages, which, you know, to the extent this continued, this is borne out over the longer time series, that'll be an interesting finding, I think. Are unions more militant on the years where their leadership were up for election? You know, how does that, we know that there's all kinds of cycles in broader national level politics based on when elections occur, what kinds of policies people propose or don't propose, whether people fight wars or don't fight wars. It depends on when they're coming up for election. So do we see that at the more micro level in unions? And it looks like that we might. Whether this continues to show up in the data as we improve it is, you know, we'll see, obviously. So that's kind of the basic thing I wanted to show you is that in the, there is some preliminary evidence in terms of the number of strike counts that political strikes are more likely as you get closer to contract time, and that when you have political strikes, you see fewer industrial strikes afterwards, or at least immediately afterwards. So a little bit of support over a 10-year period from the IRLE, and maybe there is in fact something, something to this logic. So let me just kind of summarize what we found, and then talk a little bit more about why this is of interest and where this can go. So what do we do here? Well, the things we have, we posed a puzzle that is hopefully you find interesting and relevant, and we think it's interesting and relevant to a variety of areas in political science and economics and to the community more broadly. And we took this conjecture from the LA Times, we took it seriously. We said, okay, what would you have to assume and what would you have to set up in order for this conjecture to have any real meaning in a bargaining context? So we wrote down a model that gave us some leverage on that. And we got some empirical implications that I think we can go and test. We got some preliminary data that seemed to let us know that it might not be totally wrong, this conjecture that the LA Times made. Whether or not it's something that's convincing and we have convincing evidence in favor of, I think is definitely yet to be seen and really is contingent on our ability to get better data out of the VU, the PMA, and anybody else who might be hoarding it. So, a couple things I wanted to conclude by observing. The first one I mentioned that we can take this back to the economics literature with some ideas. So what I described here is really a signaling model. There's uncertainty. It's a way for the union to transmit information to the employer. Their political activity is a way to transmit information to the employer about their willingness to fight for their own interests. So they'll take risks, they'll take on fights that are not necessarily in their own interests in a way to demonstrate that they're really willing to fight for their own interests. This is a way we can get a union to do things in their own interest and in the interest of other people, or in the interest of broader causes. And to the extent you can get that outside of a particular union, or if you believe that there's some sort of threshold model of collective behavior, let's say one union like the ILWU is very willing to do this, another union might be willing to do it if a prior union has done it. If you have this kind of cascade effect, maybe one day you get the strike wave of all these people taking strikes against the Iraq War or what have you. Unlikely, but that might give you some purchase on how that dynamic might occur in other countries where you do see behavior of that sort. You also might see situations where if you have large numbers of unions with coordinated bargaining calendars, you might actually get more political mobilization by union members, because if they all are trying to signal their own employers with political strikes, and this tends to happen together, the government is suddenly facing large numbers of workers striking on political issues, as opposed to just the ILWU kind of by itself on May Day one year taking on a strike. The other thing is coming back to that international relations literature I mentioned. There's this thing called audience costs in our literature. This is basically saying that leaders who get into a situation where they're bargaining over something, where there's a potential fight that's looming, if they can take stands that will be very costly for them to back down from, they'll do better in bargaining, but they might also increase the likelihood of war, right? And so what are audience costs? Well, it's basically where the president stands up and say, we've drawn a line in the sand that Saddam cannot cross, and if he does, we shall fight. Well, if Saddam crosses, then the president is in an awkward position where if he backs down, he looks very, very bad. And that audience cost is generated by the fact that that particular leader is subject to democratic election, more or less, and that he's able to transmit that information through some sort of media outlet to the voters at large, right? And that's the argument in international relations literature. What this brings us back to in terms of unions is the notion that if you believe this audience costing has any purchase in an organization where the leader is more regularly subject to broad-based election, and where he or she can communicate more readily with the membership in a somewhat unbiased fashion, that is to say there's more transmission of information about the stances of the leadership and their political activities to the membership, you might see a more political leader being able to take more extreme stands and also being able to do better in bargaining as a result of the combination of democratic union practices and internal union media. This is purely a conjecture based on what we know about the ILWU and based on what we kind of see coming out of these models. But it gives you a way to then link back the political orientations of union leaders, their willingness to take on broader causes, and the actual organizational rules in which they're embedded. If you go back to the Stephen Norris and Zeitlin pieces, they also find, once again, that these very, if you read the 1950s hearings, you hear of communist-dominated unions and how, they somehow took over unions and controlled them all, and they find the opposite. They find that communist unions actually tended to be much more open and democratic than their AFL, kind of more conservative counterparts. So to the extent that these open democratic practices and unions empower more radical leaders to take these stands and do better in bargaining, you may see a situation where more conservative union members might be willing to have more radical leaders because they get better contracts out of the deal ultimately. So I'm going to stop with those comments. Like I said, those last few are purely conjectures, but that's kind of the direction that the research is taking. And I'm really more excited to hear your comments or your questions or something. Thank you.